right now what we're going to focus on is the timeline, how to make keyframes, and how to animate simple processes, like if you want to animate something moving, if you want to animate something scaling, and then we'll look into how to make, as we get more comfortable with this, we'll obviously want to make things a little bit more complex, but today we'll look at the simple stuff. Okay, so I'm going to get myself a cube just to start out, and I'm going to put on line mode just so that we can see if we want to adjust something here and there. Okay, but what I'll point out to you is, obviously we've been used to working with tools up here. We've got our modes on the side. We've got our preview window. Up here is, I want to draw your attention to where it says default camera, because I'd like to introduce cameras today as well, since we are now getting into animation. You might want to then have different camera angles, or you want to have a moving camera, and that's something that is great to do as well. So we'll come back, we'll talk about camera, but I just want to point that out. We always have a camera out when we've been working in this up to this point in class. It's just been the default camera. So we can continue to use that, or we can use other cameras. So now we'll look at the other menus that we haven't necessarily looked at before. We're always using the Attributes Manager. I just want to point it out again today, because you're going to have settings here that are specifically for animation, and then you can also visit the Attributes Manager for your particular objects, and you can come here and you can animate from within this window, or at least keyframe from within this window. The big one that's new that we haven't talked about before is the timeline. So the last time we were in class, we talked about this box down here. This is the materials manager. It also pops up here depending on what you want to use. So in your Blackboard, the first thing I posted for last week when we would have met on Friday is a review of materials. So definitely you should have gone through that, and if you haven't, then definitely do, because it's been a while since we've been in class, and I'll definitely be talking about materials going forward, so make sure that you know. I'll show you how to animate those as well today. So all sorts of good stuff. Okay, so right above it though, this is the timeline. Okay, so the timeline here, you can see it goes from 0, and the last number here is 90. Okay, so this is 90 frames. So now a frame, if you're new to animation, and I think everybody is, or a lot of people are, we have 0 to 90 frames means essentially, if you imagine that every frame was a JPEG or a picture, you would have 90 JPEGs. You would have 90 pictures. You need 30 of them, so basically from 0 to 30, depending on your frames per second. You, in this case, Cinema 4D is always set to 30 frames per second. So that means it needs 30 frames to make a second of animation. So again, think of that as 30 JPEGs to make a second of animation. So you would need to go all the way from 0 to 30 to have at least 1 second of animation. Okay? If you want 2 seconds, then you go to 60. If you want 3 seconds, then you go to 90. Okay? So if you're wondering where you would change frames per second, you can hit Command D, and that brings up your project settings. And the first thing that you see underneath the scale, it says FPS, and that stands for frames per second. So Cinema 4D is set to 30 frames per second by default. Okay, now I want to point this out because different projects require different frame rates. If you're doing anything for television, for broadcast, the frames per second is not quite 30. The standard for television is 29.97. For web stuff, sometimes you'll see that people, or cartoons, people are doing 24 frames per second. So there's a big difference between 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second. So it is important to know, if you're working on a project, what frames per second you need, because if you do 30 but somebody wanted you to do 24, you're missing 6 frames, or you've got an extra 6 frames for every second. So it does make a difference. It can make your animations look faster or slower depending on if you use the wrong frame rate. So it's important to know. Okay, so we're going to leave it 30 frames per second. We don't really have a reason right now to change it. Later on, if we do have a reason to change it, then we can come back and we can say, all right, we're going to do this frames per second now. And then we'll know what that is, and we'll be able to gauge off of that as we animate. Okay, so I'm going to leave it 30 frames per second. So my timeline here is showing 90. Okay, now if I don't want to see 90, if I want to see just a second at a time, I could go down to this bar where it says 0F, and then over here it says 90F. This is your basically what would be called your in and out point for what you're previewing. So if you want to look at frame 15 for the start, and you want to look at frame 45 for the end, you can adjust your timeline so that you're only looking at those particular frames. Most of the time this is set at 0, and it's showing you the full timeline by showing you 90, okay? But if you want to see, you know, more than that, you could certainly say like 300 frames per second, or not 300 frames per second, but 300 frames. It's still 30 frames per second. And you would now be looking at 10 seconds of animation, because 300 divided by 30 would be 10. Okay, so you're looking at 10 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to bring it back down to 90 because we don't want to look at that much right now. Again, 90 would be 3 seconds. Okay, and then next to it you have some play options. This is to go to the start of the animation. This is to go to the end. Okay, these ones are, you've got previous keyframe, you've got next keyframe, this is play forwards, you've got, these ones are like sort of jumping back and forth, the previous and the next ones. So you could manipulate it how you want by what you're trying to view. Down here, this is record active objects. So this is the important thing we're going to start with. This button will let you record a keyframe. So a keyframe in animation is a frame, because obviously all of these are frames, as I've mentioned before. A keyframe is a particular frame where you're basically taking note of what exists on that frame. So you're recording the data that's on that frame. So if I'm recording what's on frame 0, I'm recording where the object is located, the scale, the rotation, the position, that kind of thing is all noted when I'm creating a keyframe. So think of a keyframe as almost like a box. You're putting all the information for the particular object in that box that you want to keyframe, that you want to record, that you want to remember. And then as you go forward in time, when you make a change, you need to make a new keyframe so that it can record the change that you make. So if you want to see animation, you need at least 2 keyframes. So you would need like 0, and then you would need, in this case I'm on 45, so I would say I need a keyframe at 45 to see something change over time. If you don't have more than 1 keyframe, if those keyframes don't change, if they're not different from each other, then you won't see any animation happening. Okay, so we'll use this button to get started. This one records the position, the scale, and the rotation. If you want to do other stuff, you're going to have to keyframe it through like the attributes manager generally. Okay, this is auto keyframing. I think when we're starting out, we want to make sure that we are using manual keyframe. Just because if you have auto keyframing, you might be making keyframes all over the place and recording all the different changes you're making and playing with, and then you end up with a really all over the place composition, and then you might be like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I don't know, and I have like, you know, tons of keyframes. So we're gonna leave the automatic alone, but it is right there. Okay, and down here there's different options. This one is how you can select your keyframes per the object. This is this means we're recording positioning. This means we're recording scale, and this one means we're recording rotation. And this one means that we are recording parameters if we choose to. Okay, and the last one here is point level animation. You'll notice that this one is gray, where the other 4 were blue. This one is off. This one is if we wanted to record point level animation. So what that means is if you were in point mode and you were moving points around, you could keyframe that. But you do have to have this switched on. If this is not switched on, if it's gray, that means it's off, and you would not be able to record the points moving. Okay, and then the last one here is the project settings. So this will bring you to here. But again, that's Command D if you need the shortcut for it. Okay, so that's the basics of the timeline. I'm going to get right into it, and I'm going to start keyframing so you can see what it is, what's happening, and obviously we'll need to practice it. Okay. One last thing before I start keyframing is I want to point out that this little blue marker here, this is the current frame that you're on. So I am currently on 45. Okay, I know that because there's a little blue square here, or a rectangle I should say, and it says 45 in blue next to it. Okay, if I couldn't tell here, then also down here in this box, this also says 45. This is telling me the current frame I'm on. So if I go back to 0, you'll see that if I click on 0, the blue rectangle shows up here, says 0 next to it in blue, and this box down here also says 0. So that's how I know that this is the current frame. Okay, and that's how I know what number I'm on. Because sometimes you might be like, oh, I'm on 50. And you might be on 50, but then you also might be one off and you might be on 51. So it does matter when you're doing stuff for sure. So you want to make sure you're actually on the frame you think you are. So this is one way to tell, and then this is definitely a more obvious way if you're not sure what's happening here. Because if you have a lot of frames, it might be hard to see where this little blue box is actually sitting. Okay, so right now I have this cube out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to record where the cube is, and I'm going to move it. Okay, very simple. So now I've got 3 seconds here. So I'm actually going to make this shorter. I'm going to say in this one I'm going to make it 30 frames per second. Okay, that way you can see the numbers bigger here. And what that means is 30 frames, I'm going to see a second of animation. It's 30 frames per second. I've got 30 frames in the preview here, so I'm looking at 1 second of animation when I hit play. Okay, so at 0, I want to record where the cube is. So I'm just going to go make sure my marker is on 0, and then I'm going to go over to this little red key symbol, and I'm going to click on it. Okay, and now you'll see a little gray box popped up on the timeline. Okay, and what that has done is it has recorded the position, the rotation, the scale, and any parameters that I'm changing. And parameters are your options that you usually see in the Attributes Manager. Okay, so I've got 1 keyframe. Now to see animation, I need to have at least a second keyframe, and that second keyframe needs to contain a change. So it can't be the same that's on 0. It has to be different, even if it's a teeny tiny little bit different. It has to be different. So I'm going to jump down to 30. And I'm going to grab the Z axis, and I'm just going to push this back here, and maybe I'll push it up as well. Okay, and now that I've made that change, I want to hit the key again. Okay, as soon as you do that, you'll know that it works, because now what you have is at 0, I have a little gray rectangle. Okay, at 30, I have a little gray rectangle. Okay, so I have 2 keyframes there, but it's important for animation for those 2 keyframes to be at least a little bit different. So I know that they're different because I see that a line popped up here in my project window with dots on it. Okay, and this is called a motion path. So now that I see a motion path, that lets me know that for sure I have created some animation because it was able to make a motion path, and the motion path is showing me where the shape is actually moving over time. Each one of those little black dots corresponds to a frame down here. So you could count them, and you could be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that would be what would be where it would be if it was over here. Okay, so you can see now this is called scrubbing. If I just grab the little blue rectangle and I move it back and forth, drag it back and forth, it lets me preview it. If I want to play, I hit the space bar here. Not the space bar, I'm sorry. I hit the play button the shortcut for me is F8. It might not be the same on yours or a Windows machine, so just keep that in mind. But if I roll over it, it tells me that the shortcut is F8, so you can see what it says on your particular machine. Okay, so there it goes. You can see that it is moving. Okay, first bit of animation in this class, very exciting. Okay, now you can zoom out and you could change your camera view, and you'll be able to see from different angles what that looks like. You can see that it is definitely picking up as it goes backwards. Okay, and this is me looking at, I'm looping now a second of animation. Okay, so as soon as it gets to 30, it jumps back to the beginning and it starts playing again. Okay, and I get myself an infinite loop here. If you don't want it to loop, you can come up here to your menu bar. I have animate here, and I can go to play mode. And you can see that by default it's on cycle. If you wanted to change that, you could. When you're starting out, I think, and for the most part, cycle is usually what you want so that you can loop it and watch it over and over again. But if you just wanted it to play once, if you wanted it to go back and forth, play to the end, then from the end play to the beginning and ping pong back and forth, you have those options too. So you can go to the animate menu and play mode, and you can change what you're looking at here. But cycle is default. It's basically the animation looping back and forth. Okay. You have some other ones here. If you want to change that, definitely different playback menu options, recording options. Again, most of these are found within the timeline down there that I showed you before. But there are a couple of things here that we'll come back and potentially look at later. But the main thing here is that if you wanted to change how it's previewing, you can come to animate, play mode, and then you choose from there. Okay, but I'm going to, obviously, I want to keep it on cycle.